just want to say thanks for coming out today. I know it's a slower time of year, a lot of folks are out of town, but this, it's good we're filming this because this is going to be a nice one today. Julie Stetson is a naturalist at the National Elk Refuge, and yeah, it's just really wonderful to have her here today. She's gotten to take some time in the galleries and prepare some information for us today. So I'll let Julie take it from here. Feel free to provide any introduction you want, and I'll be following you around with the camera. Thanks, Julie.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is really fun. I have a few things I want to talk to you guys about, but definitely if you have any questions for me, feel free to ask. Any things that you want to hear about, I'm happy to talk about really whatever you guys want to hear about. But like I said, I have a loose plan, so we'll go ahead and get started with that. I just want to move right over to the Elk Refuge painting right there. And I love this painting, although this winter didn't look like this for too long, right? There's no snow out there for a while. But I just wanted to give you guys a few updates on what's happening on the refuge right now, because there are some kind of exciting things happening. Gigi over here mentioned, she already heard that we are stopping feeding. We provide supplemental feed to the elk every year, and this year the average start date is January 28th is the average start for feeding. We started a little bit early this year. The average end date for feeding is April 4th, but we are going to stop on Saturday. So we're a bit early for stopping feed this year. The earliest they've ever stopped is March 20th, which would have been Friday. So we're pretty early, but you all know it's a pretty exceptional winter. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this before, but I did bring some alfalfa pellets with me. So you can take a look if you want. If you can take them out of the bag. I don't think that they smell very good, but that is what we feed our elk and our bison. Does anybody want to guess how much food each elk eats per day of those pellets? From the mountain? 7? You're pretty darn close. About 8 pounds. 8 pounds. We will try and ration out 8 pounds of alfalfa pellets per elk per day.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Which is not enough.
That's a good point. So it is supplemental feed, meaning that these animals cannot survive purely on the alfalfa pellets, and they do need to supplement that with natural forage.
I think it smells pretty good.
Do you?
Yeah.
Good for you. I'm glad.
Sweet. What is the protein?
Well, so it's just alfalfa, really.
I know, but alfalfa has a protein count. Do you know what they
I
use?
don't know what it is off the top of my head.
Do they still get it from over to the area?
This year, so they put out a bid every year, and I know that this year they got it from someone in Idaho.
Well, I used to bid on it.
Oh,
So
really?
I was asking.
That's interesting. Very cool. Yeah. I don't know where we'll get it in the future, but yeah. They used to provide hay, right? Just regular baled hay, but in 1975 is when they switched to the pellets. It's a bit more efficient, the nutritional content is higher, plus it doesn't blow away in the wind, and the elk don't sleep on it, poop on it as much, there's less waste, right? So that's our feeding there. Yesterday was the first day that they scaled back the feeding, because they can't go from 8 pounds of alfalfa pellets per day to nothing, because the nutritional content in there is so different from the natural forage. So they go through this kind of transition phase that takes 5 days or so, while they'll give them less and less. And same thing at the beginning of the season, they'll give them more and more when they're building up to the full ration. So that's interesting that we're ending feeding right now, and then we'll see probably some different movements of the elk. You'll maybe notice that they'll spread out more and maybe start leaving at some point soon.
How many places in the refuge do you feed them?
We have 4 feed grounds.
On the refuge? And where are all the bison? I haven't seen them at all.
Yeah. So the bison, one of the feed grounds is called McBride, and it's up in the northeast corner of the refuge, kind of up in the hills up there.
And that's where the bison
That's where the bison are, and it's really not visible from any of the roadways, the Elk Refuge Road or Highway 89. So unfortunately, it's kind of a bummer, but you really don't see them most of the winter.
Now, do you feed the bison also?
Yes.
And what do
So
you feed
They
them?
come.
the
What do you
bison,
feed them?
they eat 20 pounds per animal per day.
Of pellets?
Yes, same pellets. It was 1980 when they happened to discover, a couple of them happened to wander down onto the refuge in the winter and discover that there was free food. And that was very exciting for them. And ever since then, the population, or for the next several years after that, the population grew like 10 to 14% a year. Huge growth in the population because they were all of a sudden had all this easy food source in the winter.
Yo!
Exactly. We're gathering on quick. But the problem was, the bison are so huge that they would very easily bully the elk off of the feed lines. Even like a calf bison could prevent adult elk from eating on the feed lines. So, ever since the early 80s, the refuge has had to feed the bison separately. They never intended to feed the bison, but if they're going to feed the elk, they now have to feed the bison separately. And so that's why they'll kind of like lure them up into that corner so they can try and keep them separate from most of the other elk.
When are you going to stop the sleigh rides then? You're not feeding.
April 4th will be the last day. And that was they sort of schedule that every year as a predetermined date.
Right.
So hopefully the elk will stick around, in the area long enough for them to finish up the sleigh rides, wagon rides.
It seems to me that since it costs so much to feed the bison and feed the elk, that the hunters who want you to keep feeding them, right? So there'll be so many elk and so many bison. Shouldn't they help pay for the feed with their permits? Because I think right now, I don't think they do they?
Well, they do. You do have to pay for a permit, but I don't believe that those fees go towards feed on the refuge. The money from that is split. Wyoming Game and Fish pays for some of the feed, and then the National Elk Refuge pays for some of the feed.
What percentage of it is the Boy Scout collection?
Yeah. So the antler collection, actually those proceeds, 75% of the proceeds from the Boy Scout antler auction go to the National Elk Refuge. However, those funds are designated for, they call it habitat enhancement. So lately it's been going a lot towards, they have new irrigation programs out on the refuge that have been really successful. And so paying for irrigation equipment and also some staff, seasonal irrigators. So the money from the Boy Scouts actually does not go directly to feed.
Did they install a sprinkler system for the hay?
Yeah, they installed, a couple of years ago, they installed this new irrigation system. It's called a K-line irrigation system. And it gets dragged across the ground. And they increased the overall acreage that they irrigate. And also it's a lot more efficient, so they've been able to raise a lot more natural forage. Even more than what would be able to grow there naturally, even without overabundance of browsers on the land. So that's been really successful. We've definitely been able to produce more natural forage, which the goal behind that is to hopefully reduce the reliance on supplemental feed, so they can find more natural forage on their own.
So we had University wanted to come here and do a presentation on mule deer, and I was wondering if you guys are cutting back on feed also just to wean them off program, because they were talking about how it really messes with their birthing patterns and migration when they're fed. Does that sound right?
Well, the mule deer here don't eat the feed.
But I mean, do the elk have the same problem? Are you guys trying to wean them off? Or is it not an issue for the elk?
The birthing patterns and migration patterns aren't the main concern for having them on feed. These elk have been fed for over 100 years now, so we probably honestly don't even know that much about their natural migration patterns and everything before they were fed. However, we do definitely want to get them off supplemental feed as much as possible. The main concern is disease, because when you have the supplemental feed, you have these kind of unnatural densities of animals, normally there wouldn't be so many in the small space, and that is not a very good environment for
Jill,
disease.
you want to let this group back through?
Sure, yeah.
On science school. Smiling, you're on camera.
Candid back of your heads.
Any other questions on that so far? Okay. So the one other kind of exciting thing happening on the refuge right now is related to the Boy Scout antler auction a little bit, is that the bulls are dropping their antlers. Right? You guys may have noticed that. The biggest bulls have already dropped their antlers, most of them. They drop them first because they have the heaviest antlers. But most of the medium-sized, small-sized bulls might still have them. But it's a pretty fun time of year. You might, see a bull with one antler on, one antler not.
Do you guys start collecting them then right away while you see them being dropped?
Yeah, so the refuge has some sort of strategy for collecting the antlers because where antlers are really visible, like along the highway or something, then our staff will go out and collect them because there's concerns of poaching.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
So we don't want the public going out. I mean, it's illegal for the public to go out there and pick up the antlers on the refuge. So we'll pick up those that are really visible in the hopes of mitigating any poaching. Also, in certain areas where we have like equipment out on the refuge, and it might be a little bit of a safety concern to be running over antlers and whatnot, we'll pick them up. But where we can, we will leave them for the Boy Scouts to pick up. And so that's always really fun every year to pick up the local Boy Scouts, pick up the antlers, and then have a big elk fest in the antler auction. And I don't know if you guys know or heard about last year's auction that was record-setting. Yeah.
Chinese.
We sold, so the 10-year average for the pounds of antlers sold at the auction was around 8,000 pounds. But last year we sold 13,700
Wow.
pounds. Yeah. And then, beyond that, the average price per pound that had been paid in the past 10 years was somewhere around $10 a pound. But last year, the average price per pound was like $16.60 per pound. So when you combine the higher price and the greater amount of antlers, the 10-year average for the total revenue was somewhere over $85,000. I should probably check that I have that number right. So 10-year average was $85,000 total revenue from the auction. But last year, does anyone want to take a guess?
100 something, for sure.
$275,000. Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. We'll see what happens this year.
Happy days are here again.
It's funny because, we have these goals for the population on the refuge, right? We would like to see only about 5,000 elk on the refuge. This year, our classification count is the most accurate count that we get in the year in the middle of February. We found 8,400, so that is too many elk, more elk than we want. But hopefully that'll help us make some money at the antler auction. We'll have more antlers to sell, hopefully. I did bring a few things, and I know you guys you've probably been around the valley for a while, and you maybe are familiar with these things, but I think they're pretty neat. This is an antler in velvet, or at least partial velvet, so if you want to check that out, it's pretty cool. The velvet is what covers the antler while it's growing. Antlers are solid bone, but while they're growing, they need to be provided blood and oxygen and nutrients, and that's what the velvet does. And then once the antler is fully grown, the velvet dies and starts to fall off, but the animal will help rub it off. And I don't know if you guys have ever noticed, and this painting might not show it too well, but on most elk antlers, the main body of the antler is kind of a darker color, and it can vary a lot, but it's kind of a dark tan or brown. And that's not natural in the antler. That's actually from the elk rubbing up against conifer trees. And the sap of conifer trees will dye the color of the antler. And then the tips are usually nice, kind of shiny, pearly white. And that's on purpose also. These animals will go up to deciduous trees, which here would be cottonwoods or aspen, and they'll polish the tips of their antlers. And because it doesn't have that sap, it doesn't get the tan color.
Do you know why they do that? They itch, they have to get the...
Did this animal die or something? I mean, how did...
Yeah, so this animal would have died, when the antler was at this phase of growth. Yeah. Otherwise, it would never shed an antler like this.
It would look like that.
Yeah.
The theory behind why they do that?
The theory behind why is basically just because that's what the females like. Right?
The look?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, it's all about impressing the females, really.
That's male.
Yeah. And it's pretty cool. You can tell.
manicure.
Yeah, exactly. Certain males are darker. You can tell they've been hanging out in a certain type of habitat more than others, just because that means that there's different trees around. So, pretty interesting. It takes a lot of effort to.
I've never seen the moose on the reserve all the time. I lived here. Is there a reason for that?
We do have moose occasionally right outside the visitor center. And the reason for that is because there's those little wetlands with willows back there. And that's the good habitat for moose. They love wetland areas. Willows are one of their very favorite foods. So out in the middle of the refuge, there's not a whole lot of that for them. So they just don't have the food sources in the middle of the refuge. But we do get them behind the visitor center.
They don't eat pellets.
They do not. And in the winter, moose will actually eat twigs and branches, just like wood, basically. And it's a lot less nutritious than their summer food, and they eat a lot less than they do in the summer. But that's what they survive off of, is basically wood in the winter. And an elk can't do that.
Also on the north end of the
Oh, yeah. Exactly, yeah. That's one of the best places to find them, along the Grove River.
There's five.
Really?
Awesome.
Yeah, so you just have to have the right habitat, which most of the refuge doesn't have. So those are two kind of exciting things that are happening on the refuge right now. But even though the refuge was, established, the whole reason behind the refuge was to protect wintering grounds for elk, right? It was for the elk. But there's a lot more that goes on the refuge than just the elk. So I wanted to kind of broaden our discussion a little bit and sort of talk about the role that the Elk Refuge plays in the greater area that we are, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. You guys have probably heard that term before. We are in the middle of this 20 million acre ecosystem that includes Yellowstone, Grand Teton, the refuge, and all these surrounding national forests. And this ecosystem is considered to be the largest intact ecosystem in the lower 48. Does anybody know what an intact ecosystem is?
Has all the animals that were there originally.
Yeah, exactly. It has all of the original animals. In particular, the hardest thing to achieve with that is it has all the original predators. So when you think about it, most places in the country and even in the world have eliminated at least some, if not all, of the natural predators of an area. But we are very, very fortunate here to have all of these natural predators, and along with that, their prey and suitable habitat for them all to live in. So I thought we'd walk through and talk about a few of those exciting species and kind of the role that they play on the refuge. Sound good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I figured this is a good place to start with the wolves because just like 21 years ago, you would not have been able to say that this was an intact ecosystem, right? Because these guys were gone. From the very early 1900s, there were no wolves here. Up until 1995 was the first year that they reintroduced some wolves into northern Yellowstone and central Idaho. They planned on doing, I think it was 5 years of reintroductions, a few more wolves every year. They did 2 years, and it went so well that they didn't do anymore. And they had at the beginning of these reintroductions, they had these recovery goals in mind, and they had mapped out if the population reaches these numbers, then we'll consider the population to be recovered and can be removed from the endangered species list in the area. They reached those goals in 2002, which is way sooner than they were expecting. Although since then, as you guys probably are familiar with, there's just been a whole seesaw back and forth of the status of these populations. And even though their numbers are definitely well above those recovery goals still that they had originally set, there's been some issues with the management plans and how populations are managed and hunted or not hunted. So as of last late summer, fall, Wyoming's wolves have been relisted. They are again protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act, even though the wolves in Montana and Idaho are not. And they can be hunted now. But there's a really cool predator of this area. This is a replica skull, and it's a little bit misleading because it's a Siberian wolf, so it's maybe a little bit bigger than our wolves. But it does display some very good predator traits, which are that the eyes of predators are always going to face forward, right? Kind of like our eyes. But when you think about any predator species that you know, all their eyes are facing forward. The reason for that is then their vision, each eye sees, an overlapping thing of the other eye. So like if you were to close one of your eyes, you still see fairly similar things, right? That gives you really good depth perception. You can tell how far things are away from you, so how quickly you need to chase them, or how long you need to sprint to catch up with them. So that's the reason why these guys have eyes in the front of their head. Plus, if they're predators, they probably don't have to worry too much about things coming after them, and so they don't need the huge peripheral that other prey species have. And then the other very distinct thing about a predator skull is, of course, the teeth, right? Wolves are a really good example of that. These are really sharp teeth meant for basically nothing but tearing into meat. Right? So it's a lot different than a prey skull, which I'll show you later. These guys have developed, of course, a very effective hunting strategy. They hunt in packs. Here in this ecosystem, the wolves primarily prey on elk, but an elk is anywhere from like 5 to 10 times the size of one wolf. So you can imagine it would be basically impossible for one wolf to take down an elk by itself. But when they group up into a pack, they can do it a lot more efficiently. These guys have really incredible endurance. They're not really that fast on their own, maybe like 35 miles per hour, which is similar to that of an elk. So they're not super fast, but they have really good endurance, and they can travel really long distances over a day or two. On the refuge right now, so we have one kind of really established pack on the refuge, the Pinnacle Peak Pack. It's a bit of a tongue twister, I think. A lot of P's. And it's a fairly large pack. Last year when we counted, there was 12 adults in the pack, which is pretty big. This year, they actually have a new alpha male, which has been kind of exciting. It's a black wolf, and it came from somewhere up in the national park, we think. But it seems like he has become the new alpha male of this pack here, so it's kind of exciting. And we have also seen a few other wolves that we know did not originally come from the Pinnacle Peak Pack hanging out on the refuge. So we might see some changing dynamics here in the next few years with wolves on the refuge.
Do they chase other packs away? I mean, they want to be the only ones?
Yeah, so wolves are really territorial, definitely. And they will fight very hard to defend their territory. Probably the biggest threat or predator to a wolf is another wolf that they get into a fight with over territory or maybe dominance in the pack. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I always think, so there's like over 8,000 elk on the refuge. You would think that wolves would just be having a heyday and there would be, 8 packs of wolves out there feasting on the elk, right? But the reason why that's not the case is because wolves are very territorial. And so they have to spend a lot of time and energy defending territory. And this territory is really, really productive in the winter, but it's empty in the summer, right? So it's not necessarily worth all the time and energy to defend a territory that is only productive 6 months out of the year. So that's the reason why we haven't seen a crazy amount of wolves on the refuge yet. But we'll see if their populations grow.
Isn't it the alpha female that controls the pack? The alpha female?
Usually, I mean, the male and female are definitely the head, but the female is a little bit...
I thought.
She's got a little bit more power.
And then she keeps everybody else in line, which I enjoy.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry. Don't they did in February?
they will, yeah. And
That's why we're here.
yeah, the last I heard from our biologist was that the den site was probably somewhere, the one that they have been using in the past is on the very northeast side of the refuge. It's kind of in the boundary with the national forest. So most likely that's where they're denning now. But I don't know for sure. So that's a little bit about our wolves. And then since we're right here, thought we'd also mention this really cool predator, the mountain lion. Has anybody seen a mountain lion?
Not for years. I have, but not recently.
Yeah, I've never seen one in the wild.
I've never seen
one.
I saw the denning mother with the cubs come on the Elk Refuge Road years ago.
Yeah.
That was in '99, I think.
Yeah, I saw
That was a
that.
while. That was a long time
That
ago.
was a while ago.
I remember
We
that.
had
At least 10
tracks
years. There was
in
one.
Indian trails this year.
Oh,
We
really?
had puma tracks and cougar tracks.
Wow.
Yeah. So they know they've been there, but I don't think anybody.
They're
saw
nocturnal,
it.
aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the reason it's hard to see them.
It
Yeah.
was interesting because they had the one that was over by Smith's. You know,
Yes.
the kids were going to school.
Yes.
It was about that time the tracks turned up. Of course, High School Butte is right there, which is a good outlook for them.
Definitely. Yeah, so a lot of times you'll hear more, you'll kind of see more evidence of them, like tracks or, you know, a carcass or something like that. But these guys are so elusive and so rare. I think they're incredible animals. So we know that they're out there, even though they're very rarely seen. On the refuge, there's been a few very significant sightings, but yeah, they've been very sparse. So the one is that 1999 mother and kittens. And then last year or the year before, there was those kittens on the fence, on the bucket rail fence, and the coyotes were in the background. I don't know if anyone saw photos of them. They were spread around the internet a lot.
Wish I took that picture.
Yeah, really cool. But these guys are definitely more of the silent predator type, you know. They are nocturnal, but also their style of hunting is kind of the stalking and the surprising. So, you know, if a mountain lion is after you, you don't know it until it's probably too late, right? A lot of times they might hang out in trees and wait for something to come by and pounce out of trees, find their prey. They're also, they're going to feed primarily on deer is probably their favorite, but also some smaller animals, porcupines. These guys, mountain lions, are one of the very few animals that will go after a porcupine. As you can imagine, a porcupine would be pretty intimidating, right? But porcupines have quills all over their body, except for their stomachs. Yeah. So these guys,
know that.
exactly, they know that they'll flip them over and get at their bellies. This is just one of my favorite fun facts, but does anyone want to guess how many quills a porcupine has on his body?
Has somebody counted them?
You had to count more than one in order to get an average, I'm sure.
10,000.
That's a pretty good guess, 10,000. It's actually somewhere around 30,000.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
I wonder you see it in so much Native American jewelry. They have lots to work with.
I didn't know they could be tamed, but they can.
What a perfect pet.
I have to know, at Zeno's cabin in Vale, up Beaver Creek, they had a porcupine that started hanging out, and then she brought her babies as they came, and they fed them homemade bread, wheat bread. And so they were very used to it, and you could sit down, and then she would come up and she would put her feet up on you and say, bread. And so the baby, and you could reach out and kind of go, a little bit on the cheek. They were very, very tame. I don't know if they still have them, but they had them for years.
Really?
I thought, wow, tame porcupines, what is that?
But they can eat it around a tree in one night.
Oh, yeah, that kind of,
Yes.
So,
Or some of your patio furniture.
they fed these guys bread, and I don't know how they protected the trees. Maybe they have metal around them or something.
Maybe.
Yeah, must have.
Oh, that's interesting. So yeah, these guys are another really cool predator on the refuge, even though they're not seen very often. I think they're very impressive, and it's fun to know that they're out there. We will continue. So of course, another one of the most charismatic predators in the ecosystem is the grizzly bear, and also we can maybe lump black bears in with this, bears in general. We do not see them frequently on the refuge at all, but both species have been seen very occasionally out there. And I'm curious to see in the next few years, because, I don't know, some of you guys have heard that grizzly bears seem to be moving farther and farther south. It seems like in the fall we've been seeing them on the village road more
Yes,
and more frequently.
looking in my kitchen window.
Really?
Yeah.
Grizzly bear?
A grizzly bear? Hi. 6 a.m.
Last year, we saw a grizzly cub on the pass, on Teton Pass.
Oh.
Going up the side. I wouldn't have seen it if the car hadn't stopped in front of us.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty far
It was
south.
it was about this time of year, so what would that
Okay.
be? A year-old cub, he was, half grown.
Wow. Yeah, so we'll see what happens. It's very possible. I wouldn't be too surprised if we started seeing more bear sightings on the refuge. This year, of course, with our kind of weird winter, it has been interesting because bears have been coming out of hibernation a little bit early, at least some of them. The males always come out before any females that have cubs. So, like in Yellowstone, it's been several weeks since they found the first bear or two that was out and about, which is pretty early. And I also heard that there was a grizzly boar out in Grand Teton the other day.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You mean up by us, Papa?
It was right around Beaver Creek area, like Taggart Lake.
Where we skied.
Yeah, so start bringing your bear spray if you guys are out and about.
Think of that.
Yeah. So these guys are up. Their hibernation is sort of a spectrum, you can think of it. It's not like a black and white thing. And these guys have a relatively light hibernation, if you will. Their body temperature only drops like maybe 7 degrees or something, not very much. And their respiration and their heart rate lowers, but not very much. When you compare the changes that these guys go through compared to like a Uinta ground squirrel, it's very, very different. Uinta ground squirrels, their body temperature will go from 90 or so down to 39 degrees. And they're hardly breathing, their heart is hardly beating, and if you were to find a ground squirrel that's hibernating, you could pick it up, you could handle it, move it around, it would not wake up. But you poke a bear a few times and it's gonna wake up. Sometimes these guys will even wake up in the middle of their hibernation and just kind of get up, see what's going on, and go back to sleep. So it's not unheard of to see one in the middle of winter. And the only reason why they hibernate is because of a lack of food. It just gets too difficult for them to find food in the middle of winter here with all the snow that we get. But when you think of bears, like in Florida, black bears down in Florida, they don't hibernate because they can find food all year long. So it's not something that they totally need to do. It just depends on the food source and where they are. So these guys are omnivores, right? They'll eat just about anything, but they are also one of the fiercest predators in the ecosystem, right? And you can see they definitely have those physical characteristics of predators, being the small eyes facing forward and some pretty good teeth on them. But they'll also have some molars that are good for eating grasses and plants and things like that. Of course, there are other predators in the ecosystem, some really, really cool and rare ones like wolverines Those guys haven't been spotted on the refuge, but they're definitely in the ecosystem.
I had one on my property over in the Teton Valley, and just below Pine Creek Pass. One night I was coming home and I had the headlights on and I was driving into dirt road where I had a home down in the wetlands there. And I saw this back end of something about that high, and it looked like a cub, a bear cub, the back end of it waddling. And then it turned sideways, and it was long, and it had this band up over this long nose. I couldn't believe it, and I just watched, and he scurried off. But we've been hearing something chewing on wood. You know, he's probably chewing on the rotten wood, looking for grubs or something in the wetlands for several days. I'm sure that's what it was. But everybody there said be quiet about it so people won't come in, they won't harass.
Yeah.
You know, so we didn't say anything, but that was about 4 years ago, I guess.
Wow.
Cool.
That's incredible.
What about coyote?
And
Yeah.
foxes.
Are you going to talk about elk?
Yep, and fox, yeah.
Yep, coyotes, foxes.
We live down at the end of the butte, we've had red and gray fox all winter.
Really? Oh, interesting. There's foxes here that come in interesting color. They're red. The species is red fox, but they come in these really interesting colors. I've actually seen some. I haven't seen one myself, but I've seen these pictures of. They're black. These foxes.
Yeah,
but they're all
some
red
are silver.
foxes.
Yeah.
Some
Gray
are
foxes
kind
aren't
of
here.
silver.
Gray foxes are
Right. Right. Yeah.
Sure, are great
So
color.
species-
Yeah, they're a great
Right.
color.
Right. So the species we have here is the red
Kids have
fox.
chickens, that's why they hang around.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have any questions about foxes or coyotes, I can answer them. I didn't bring anything with them, but those guys are preying on small mammals, right? They're really fun if you happen to catch them mousing, where they're pouncing.
Really
Oh,
cute.
yeah, so cool. And especially in the snow, foxes in particular. So that, you might see them walking around, and they are listening. They can hear the mice and the voles moving under a couple feet of snow. That's how they find them, is by listening to them, which I think is, I can't imagine being able to hear a mouse that's moving 2 feet underneath the snow. Another predator that uses the same technique is owls. Okay? And that's, I think, even more impressive because they're listening from the air. So they're even a little bit higher up, and they can hear those guys moving around down there, and they'll punch right through and grab up dinner. It's pretty incredible. So we definitely also have a lot of raptors. Those are really interesting predators. Owls, hawks, osprey, eagles. We've had a lot of eagle sightings on the refuge this year.
I saw a golden just coming in from the parking lot. It was a golden.
Awesome.
A golden.
I haven't seen one in a long time.
Are you sure it wasn't like a juvenile bald eagle?
Baldy. Well, it may have been, but it was pretty good size.
It's hard to tell sometimes,
It is.
especially.
It was right up above the museum butte here.
Yeah, it certainly could have been either. We have definitely seen a lot of goldens this year.
Now we have the bald eagles over on High School Butte. They nest up there.
Oh, very
So
cool.
we see them quite often.
Good. Yeah, they're really fun. They're definitely out on the refuge a lot, feeding on those carcasses.
How many carcasses are out there right now?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head. But there's probably, I don't know, a couple dozen. I don't know. When you think there's 8,400 elk, and it's
bound to be
the
some
toughest
that
time
die,
of
yeah,
year.
natural
Right,
causes.
yeah.
One year through the scope here in the museum, we counted, several people counted 27 bald eagles and juveniles around a fresh elk carcass.
But no
And,
wolves.
and lots of other little birds saying, hurry, hurry.
The ravens and the
Yeah, right,
magpies,
yeah.
I love that.
But, I mean, 3 people counted them, so we were pretty sure how many
That's
there were.
incredible.
You know, so that probably was a bald eagle juvenile then,
Yeah.
because they're mainly in this area.
Maybe. Could have been
I
either.
wanted to ask you another question. Are they still doing research on the wolverine and keeping track of where they are in our ecosystem?
Yeah, actually, I just was skiing on the park road last weekend, and we came by some folks on a snowmobile and asked them what they were doing, and they were part of the wolverine research crew.
So they are.
They were out there taking down their traps, which is a little bit earlier than they liked, but it's because bears were coming out, and they don't want to have the traps up when bears are there. And I asked him, if they had caught any wolverines this year, and they said they did trap one over on the Idaho side. So
Maybe it's my favorite. What if they trap them and tag them and then turn them loose again?
Yeah.
I know they put out the barbed wire to catch the fur because they can't always see them, but they know where they've been from the scab and the fur.
Yeah, and they can collect DNA and identify them. They also do this really cool thing with wolverines where they'll put a bait like up high so that the wolverine has to stand on its hind legs and reach up with its front legs to get it. And then they have this camera that takes a picture of its belly. And the reason for that is because every wolverine they have white on their belly, but it's all a unique pattern. So you can tell the difference, you can distinguish between wolverines by the pattern on their stomach.
I didn't realize they were so big.
Oh,
I thought they were small, and I understand they were very aggressive.
Yeah. Oh, very.
And the back looked like a bear.
yes, a lot of people say that. A lot of people say they kind of walk a little bit like this,
They
like a
waddle.
bear.
It was.
And what was I just going to say? Oh, so they're in the weasel family, which also includes little long-tailed, short-tailed weasels, but also otters, martens, and badgers. And all of these animals are really ferocious.
Yes.
Yeah, even like a little, short-tailed weasel.
Badgers.
Badgers. These guys are, they're some of the smallest carnivores in the world. And they'll be hunting mice and voles, and they'll even take down like a hare that can be a lot bigger than they are.
There were 5 of us hiking over in the Teton Valley on the north end of the valley up, what is that area over there? It's towards Teutonia. It's back in the woods, and there's a trail that goes through there. And there were about the same number of us on a path walking, and we heard this hissing up ahead, and one girl in front jumped and came back, and here was this badger, and he was coming toward us, hissing.
He wasn't going to back up either.
And no, they don't, and we had to really hightail it back, not run, but back up, and finally he went off. But the numbers didn't deter him at all. He just kept coming.
They're
He had
not
a
afraid of
kind of
anything.
black stripe down the side of their. It was really aggressive.
Yeah, all those weasels are.
I don't know, it may have been a female. There may have been a den that closed. or
Maybe,
something.
maybe not. Wolverines have been known to fight off grizzly bears from a kill.
Oh my gosh.
So it's pretty spectacular. There's some pretty incredible predators. But, of course, we have to have something for all these predators to eat, right? So we also have a lot of prey species, and I just wanted to talk about a few of those. So I'm going to move over into the next room there. So I think one of the most interesting prey species in this valley is the pronghorn. Yeah, these guys are incredible. They're very unique for a lot of different reasons, but they're also very good examples of the physical differences between a predator and a prey. So you can see these eye sockets are basically on the sides of the head, right? These guys have an incredible peripheral vision. They can see, so if they just keep their head facing forward and don't move their head, they can see roughly 300 degrees around them. Oh, wow. Yeah, so if I was a pronghorn, I'd be able to see my hand back here. It's pretty crazy. That means that they do give up a lot of depth perception that the predators have. But that's a pretty cool feature of these guys. And then, of course, their teeth look a lot different. The flat, grinding molars that allow them to eat plants and vegetation, right? So the prey species, they need to have not so much a hunting strategy like the predators, but they need a defense strategy. They need a way to get away from the predators. And these guys, of course, have developed really a lot of speed, right? They're the fastest land animals in North America, second fastest land animals in the world. So they'll sprint upwards of around 60 miles per hour. And actually, if you put them in a race with a cheetah for like 5 miles or so, the pronghorn is going to win. Because not only are they able to sprint incredibly fast, but they also have really great endurance. So they can essentially outrun any predator that they have here. The reason for that, the theory at least, is that these guys probably evolved here on this continent when we had kind of basically a North American cheetah. We used to have this cat here that was the main predator, we think, of these guys. So they evolved to outrun them. But that cat has since gone extinct, and these guys have not.
Nobody gave them the word.
Yeah. So they're just really fast. I'll pass this guy around. This is a replica skull, but this is a real horn, which is kind of neat. Different from an antler because it's made out of keratin, or the same thing that your fingernails are made out of. Usually, the other main difference between horns and antlers is that antlers are shed every year and regrow every year, and horns are permanent throughout an animal's entire life. But of course, the pronghorn have to be unique and different, and they actually do shed this outer sheath of their horn every year. And we do not know why they do that. It's very weird. But not really. Well, so this is a male, right, that has the bigger and the pronged horn. And so the first few years of the male's life, it's not going to be fully grown. But for the most part, they don't. It's not like the differences in an elk where it's really obvious it's getting bigger and bigger. So we don't really know why they do that. And what happens is, so when this outside part is shed, they still have this bony piece coming out of the skull here. But when this falls off, it's not like you're looking directly at the bone. Actually, the new horn is already growing underneath it. So you'll see this like thin layer. It's black. And it looks like a new horn that's starting to grow. Thank you.
When do they show?
In November, usually. So a lot of times here, we don't see that. You would notice that it doesn't have this kind of curved part and doesn't have the prong yet. It just looks like this.
Is it dark? Or is it white?
It's dark because it has the first layer of the new horn already on it. But yeah, we're not used to seeing that because it usually happens in November when most of our pronghorn are usually out of the valley, right? Migrating south of here to get away from the deep snow. However, this year and last year,
They didn't leave. They saw them and stayed.
yeah, we've had about 55 pronghorn stay on the refuge all winter long, which is unusual. They should be migrating. They lucked out this year and had a pretty mild winter, and we have not seen a significant die-off at all, like we might have expected. So they did really well here this year. We'll see what happens in the coming years with the population, and if more and more try and do the same thing, or if they go back to migrating, we don't know. But if you do happen to be out in November, December, looking at these guys, you can look for the shed horns, or what it looks like when they've lost the old horn. It's pretty neat. It grows really quickly, so you don't have a lot of time to see it in that stage, but it's pretty neat. So these guys, they don't have predators, but their main threat is habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, which I think this conservation gallery is a good testament to, right? These guys are a bit threatened just because of they're losing their homes. A lot of development happening in the sagebrush flats, a lot of energy development, and it's definitely hard for these guys, especially if they're migrating, because they hate to jump. They don't like jumping. It's very weird. And so if there's fences in their migration, it's a big problem for them. They'll try their hardest to go around or under a fence, and then they can sometimes get injured. So things like that are definitely a big problem for these guys. Hopefully we can mitigate them as much as possible. But are there any questions about pronghorn?
So they're not an antelope. Why do they still keep calling them an antelope?
Yes, they are not an antelope. They're not related to antelope at all. But it's just kind of one of those things. It's similar to buffalo and bison, right? Our bison are not buffalo. The only true buffalo are in Africa and Asia. But, back before people knew these things, they said, well, it kind of looks like an antelope, so we'll call it an antelope. Before they really knew the kind of classification, and it just kind of stuck. But if you want to be really accurate, you'll only call it a pronghorn.
What are their numbers like? Are they starting to recover? Or
Well,
are we losing the battle there because of the habitat?
Here in Wyoming, they're declining a little bit, but overall they're doing really well in Wyoming. There's actually somewhere around 500,000 in the state of Wyoming, which is right around the same population number as people, which is incredible. There are some other subspecies, like the Sonoran pronghorn, further south, they're like in Arizona. Those guys are not doing well.
They're a little smaller, I think.
I think they're a little bit smaller, and they're very threatened. So it depends, there's like certain pockets in the country where they're doing better or worse than others.
Do you know when we used to come to Jackson in the 50s. And everybody that lives here is probably aware of that, like you. There were herds of them on the benches over here on the, as you drove out of Jackson toward the park. You'd see herds of them all along, and there'd be hundreds.
Yeah.
You don't see that anymore.
What are their disease threats? Are they subject to chronic wasting disease? And all, in fact, for all of the ungulates, what's threatening right
They
now?
get pneumonia, I think, don't they?
That's a really big issue with bighorn.
That was also the problem.
I'm sure that it probably could affect them, but I haven't heard a lot of concern about them with the pronghorn. Actually, I haven't heard serious concerns for any diseases with the pronghorn. But
Or
that
mule
doesn't.
deer or elk?
Yeah.
That's different. That's a different story.
So one big thing is brucellosis, which is present in our elk and our bison. And the biggest concern there is the potential to spread it to cattle and livestock. And that's why, especially like in Yellowstone, they have a lot of controversy of when the bison leave the park and go out into areas where there's ranches. And even out on the refuge here, that's one of the reasons why they want to keep elk on the refuge, to not let them get onto private land where there might be cattle, because of the threat of brucellosis spreading. And brucellosis, what it does often is it causes a female to abort its first calf. So obviously ranchers are pretty concerned about that. And then chronic wasting disease is really scary. We do not have it yet in Jackson Hole. We have never had a confirmed case of it, but at this point it might just be a matter of time. I think the nearest case was maybe down in Star Valley. There was a moose, I think.
We had one die in our yard over in the Teton Valley, in the same area where I saw the badger. And we didn't realize at the time what was wrong with her. She was shaking, she couldn't stand up, she'd stumble, and she had diarrhea, and she was just...
Was it moose?
It was a moose. And she was real thin, and it was in the spring. We called the local Fish and Game guy, and he told us that's what you get for living in the wildlands. It's your problem.
It's their property.
No. And so she finally died, and my husband and a neighbor put gloves on and pulled her out and put line all over on a lot that we had beside our property there in the wildlands.
So did anyone come out and test?
They didn't, and they should have, and it wasn't until afterwards when we talked to them that they said she probably had Krusell's
Chronic wasting
disease, which is the same as Krusell, whatever it's called, that you can transmit through the meat to humans.
Yeah, it's like mad cow.
Same thing. So that's kind of iffy, and that was about 15 years ago.
Oh, interesting.
So, but they didn't want to deal with it. So I don't know.
Might not have been on their radar as much as it is now.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But when looking back on it, her symptoms, because my husband was in the cattle business in Texas, he said that's chronic wasting disease, the way she was.
That's very
He
interesting.
tried to talk to him about it. They never came out and tested the remains or anything. But I'm sure that's what it was. It was really sad.
Wow. Yeah, so that's definitely scary, especially because we're noticing that mule deer migrate more than we thought that they did originally, and we think that there might be mule deer migrating from areas that do have some chronic wasting disease. That's a little bit scary, and it actually stays in the soil for years, like 5 years or so. So even if you somehow can get rid of all the animals that have it, it can still be in the soil.
And that's not spread from the soil to humans.
They don't,
It
as
is
far as
through
I
the
know,
meat, I know.
yeah, as far as I know, it cannot be spread through the soil to
But
humans.
it's through the neurological parts of the carcass, through the brain or the spinal column or the nerve tissue.
Yeah,
It's scary.
it is, a little bit. But hopefully...
They had a group of men that were eating at a wild banquet in Wisconsin or Minnesota, and there were about 30 people at this banquet, and 6 of them came down just 2 or 3 years later with Crusoe, and they traced it back to the wild game that they had at that dinner.
Oh.
And there's never been another event like that that's been documented. It's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So people can get brucellosis. I know someone she had it for 5 years before it was diagnosed.
Wow, I think that's
How do you enjoy the art collection? Do you see a really great connection between what we see? Yeah, that was getting gruesome, sorry.
Right.
Do you see a great connection between the art that's present here and the relationship with the National Elk Refuge?
Yeah, definitely. I think that this one in particular, the Conservation Gallery, and considering there's 2 species, the pronghorn and the bison, that are out on the refuge, I think that's really great because both of these species have, pronghorn more so currently, bison more so in the past, have had some really serious conservation issues, but it's great that there's a showcase right outside of a habitat, an area where they can thrive today. And of course, all wildlife, you know, has some threats. The discussion about ivories over there with the elephants, and I know there's another ivory exhibit, the Asher Jay stuff in the other room.
Yes,
Yeah, that reminds me of elk ivory poaching, which thankfully today is not really a big deal, but historically that really threatened elk populations. People would poach and kill elk just for the couple of ivory teeth. Yeah, so that's an interesting link to the past.
I think you just showed Case.
Yep.
I'm just saying.
Yep.
Yeah.
He's also one of our living artists, part of Western Visions, which is way cool.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. And yeah, and just the diversity of species that are in here, I think highlights the diversity of species that are outside, right outside the window there, both on the refuge and in the greater ecosystem. The refuge, I think it can come across as a little bit monotonous, you know, you look out there and it's just like grass and elk, you know, but when you take a closer look, you see that there are all these really incredible relationships between species and a really impressive diversity of species that are out there. So I think that that's really neatly reflected in the museum as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. This is really fun. And if you guys have any, I know it's noon, but if you have any other questions, I'm happy to hang out for a little bit and chat.
And you're also speaking next week, right? Wild Wednesday on the 25th at 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock. When are you meeting with Sally Bird?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
So Sally is going to help with that docent tour of the wildlife.
Great.
So get your reservations if you want to make the final Wild Wednesday. Tonight's the last night that Francis Kerber is playing, and next week we'll have Julie and Sally doing 2 tours. We moved it up to 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock. Of course, you won't have the time to go into this much detail.
I know.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys very much.
My son was ice fishing on Jackson Lake last week, and he said there were 4 fox watching. And the minute he'd pull it up, they'd come closer. So they must really like fish.
Yeah, definitely.
Did he finally give them some fish? I hope.
No, I think he took his fish home.
That's awesome. So a lot of otters will do that too.
Yeah,
Otters
so
are really
much fun.
opportunistic.
I know.
Yes.
Do you have otters on the refuge?
You know, I've asked if there's been any sightings, and I think that they have been seen in Flat Creek, but it's super rare. We have a lot of mink. Not a lot, but I mean, sorry, not mink, muskrats. Mink are incredibly rare in this ecosystem.
But there's a lot of vermin.
Yes.
So where would you go see otters?
Along the river.
I've actually seen them in the river, but
seen
not regularly. But they're up and down. They keep moving.
The Snake River?
Yeah.
The lodge is up in Teton.
Grand
Grand Teton Park, the lodge, and there's a
Jackson
pond
Lodge.
just before you get to Jackson Lake Lodge turnoff. Over there on the left.
Oh,
Every
yeah.
year that we've driven by there, they're down there.
Really?
And if you'll stop and just watch, they're in there.
Yeah.
You just have to walk. Because there's a lot of
Oxbow
weeds.
Bend is also,
Yeah.
Oxbow Bend up there is probably, that's where I've seen the most otters, is up
I don't
there.
know, what do they call that pond that's right next to it?
Christian Pond?
Is
Well,
that-
that's up to the right.
Used to be Christian Pond, but that's
No,
gone.
they may be over there too. It's on the west side. The west side.
Oh,
Yeah, I know
okay.
which one you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that has an official name really. That little guy right there.
Yeah,
Right
it's
in-
not very big, but they're really active in there. They lay on their backs. And you just got to
I need to go out there sometime.
We were floating, and my mother had gotten fish for a couple of baby otter. and there was a huge sandhill crane, and he kept trying to get the fish that she was feeding, and she'd jump at him and he'd stand back, but we finally floated out. I don't know what happened, but she was not going to let that crane get anywhere near her babies and the fish.
Oh, fun.
So much fun.
20 years since I've seen it.
Oh, I love it.
I've got to go look at it.
Really?
Right. And it just, thank you.